The great hall of the Galactic Council buzzed with the usual arguments and complaints. Representatives from dozens of alien species sat in their floating chairs, talking loudly about trade routes and territory disputes. The massive dome above them showed the stars of their galaxy, each point of light representing worlds under Council control. Ambassador Jake Morrison sat quietly in the human section, listening to the Zelthron representative complain about human mining operations in the Outer Rim. The blue-skinned alien waved his forearms dramatically as he spoke about how humans were taking too much rare metal from asteroid fields. Jake had heard these complaints many times before. The council members always found something wrong with what humans did. They said humans expanded too fast, worked too hard, and asked too many questions about things that were supposed to be secrets. Most of the time, Jake just nodded politely and promised to pass along their concerns to Earth. His communication device beeped softly during a particularly boring speech about shipping regulations. Jake glanced down at the small screen and felt his blood turn cold. The message was short and came directly from Earth Command with the highest security codes possible. Protocol 7 active. All human assets begin immediate withdrawal from Council space. No exceptions, no delays. Execute. Within 72 hours. Jake stared at the message for a long moment. Protocol 7 was something he had hoped never to see. It meant complete evacuation of all human presence from Council territory. Every colony, every ship, every person was to leave immediately and head for the coordinates that appeared at the bottom of the message. He looked around the chamber at the alien representatives, who were still arguing about minor trade issues. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. Jake stood up quietly and walked toward the exit, his heart pounding in his chest. Counselor Vexhar of the Zelthrons noticed him leaving and called out with obvious satisfaction in his voice. "Ah, the human representative leaves during our important discussion. How typical of your species to avoid responsibility when faced with legitimate criticism." Several other aliens made sounds of agreement. The tall, insect-like Vrex representative clicked his mandibles in what Jake knew was their version of laughter. Perhaps Ambassador Morrison goes to arrange another one of their famous threats to leave the Council. We have heard such empty promises before. Jake paused at the door and turned back to face the chamber. For a moment, he considered telling them what was really happening, but his orders were clear. No explanations, no warnings, no attempts to negotiate, just leave. "Goodbye, counselors," he said simply, and walked out of the chamber for the last time. Within hours, the evacuation began across dozens of star systems. On the agricultural world of New Denver, farmers received the emergency broadcast while working in their vast wheat fields. Without question or complaint, they began shutting down their equipment and heading for the evacuation ships that appeared in orbit within minutes. Captain Lisa Barnes of the Council enforcement vessel Harmony's Edge was patrolling the border between human and Altarian space when her sensors detected unusual activity. Dozens of human ships were moving at high speed toward the Galactic Rim, far from any known trade routes. She tried to contact the human vessels, but received only automated responses saying they were conducting routine exercises. Something about their movement patterns seemed wrong to her experienced eye. These weren't merchant ships or even military vessels on patrol. They looked like evacuation fleets. The mining station, Ceres Point, had been operated by humans for over 50 years. It employed 12,000 people and produced rare metals that dozens of Council species depended on for their technology. The station commander, a gruff man named Bill Watson, received his orders while reviewing production reports. Bill looked at the evacuation order for a full minute before activating the station-wide communication system. "All personnel report to designated evacuation areas immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." The evacuation proceeded with the efficiency that humans were known for throughout the galaxy. Within 18 hours, every person on the station was aboard transport ships heading for deep space. The automated systems were left running, the lights were left on, and the doors were left unlocked. But not a single human remained. Dr. Richard Hayes was in his office on the Council homeworld when reports began coming in about human activities across the galaxy. As the Council's leading expert on human psychology, he was often asked to explain human behavior when it confused other species. The reports made no sense to him at first. Every human colony, station, and ship was simply leaving. There had been no major diplomatic crisis, no declaration of war, no dramatic speeches. The humans were just going away quietly and efficiently. He pulled up his files on human historical patterns and began searching for similar events. What he found made him deeply worried. Throughout their history, humans had shown a pattern of behavior that other species often misunderstood. When pushed beyond a certain point, they didn't fight back immediately. Instead, they withdrew, adapted, and returned stronger than before. On the pleasure world of Paradise Bay, human tourists and workers began boarding evacuation ships, even as alien visitors watched in confusion. The beautiful resort planet had been jointly operated by humans and several other species for decades. Human staff simply handed over their duties to confused alien coworkers and walked away from jobs they had held for years. A Qualian diplomat asked one of the departing humans why they were leaving so suddenly. The human woman, a hotel manager named Susan Wright, just smiled sadly and said, "We were asked to leave too many times. So we're leaving." The Galactic Council emergency session was called as reports flooded in from across known space. Humans weren't just leaving their own colonies. They were abandoning joint ventures, mixed settlements, and integrated communities where they had lived alongside other species for generations. Counselor Prime Zethkala demanded answers from the empty human delegation seats. The other representatives looked around nervously as they realized the scope of what was happening. Humans made up less than 5% of the Council's population, but they were involved in nearly 40% of all industrial, agricultural, and technological operations. Captain Barnes arrived at New Denver 3 days after the evacuation began. The planet looked perfectly normal from orbit. The cities were still lit, the agricultural systems were still running, and the communication networks were still active. But when her landing party reached the surface, they found a world empty of human life. The colony showed no signs of panic or hasty departure. Meals were still warm in some houses. Children's toys were arranged neatly in playrooms. Gardens were watered and well-maintained. It was as if 12 billion people had simply vanished into thin air. In the governor's mansion, Barnes found a single datapad left on the main desk. It contained coordinates pointing toward the galactic rim and a brief message: "When you need us, you'll know where to find us." Barnes looked around the empty office and felt a chill run down her spine. For the first time in her career, she wondered if the Council had made a terrible mistake. 6 months had passed since the last human ship disappeared from Council space, and the Great Hall buzzed with celebration. Counselor Prime Zethkala stood at the central podium, his golden robes shimmering under the dome lights as he addressed the assembled representatives. Fellow Council members, today marks a new era of peace and prosperity for our great alliance, he announced with obvious satisfaction in his voice. The removal of the troublesome human element has brought stability to our trade networks and eliminated the constant disputes that plagued our sessions. The Altarian delegate stood and applauded, his silver skin reflecting the chamber lights. Our shipping profits have increased by 30% since we took over the former human trade routes. No longer do we have to compete with their reckless underbidding and impossible delivery schedules. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. The insect-like Rex representative clicked his approval while the blue-skinned Zelthrans waved their forearms in celebration. Even the normally quiet Quellians nodded their large heads in apparent satisfaction. The Sindari ambassador rose from her floating chair, her tentacles swaying as she spoke. My government wishes to thank the Council for finally taking action against human technological interference. Since their departure, our research facilities have seen unprecedented advances without the constant pressure to match human innovation rates. Dr. Richard Hayes sat in the observation gallery, watching the celebration with growing unease. As the Council's expert on human behavior, he had been asked to provide analysis on the long-term effects of human departure. His reports had been largely ignored by the celebrating politicians below. Councillor Vexhar took the floor next, his forearms gesturing dramatically. I personally remember the constant headaches caused by human unpredictability. They never followed proper protocols, always asked uncomfortable questions, and refused to accept their proper place in the galactic hierarchy. Good riddance to bad? Influence, I say? The chamber erupted in approval. Species that had competed with humans for resources, territory, and influence were now dividing up the abandoned assets among themselves. The Vrex Consortium had claimed most of the former human mining operations, while the Altarians took over the shipping networks. In his private office after the session, Hayes reviewed his classified reports with growing concern. The economic data looked good on the surface, but deeper analysis revealed troubling patterns. Human colonies had been developing technologies that the Council didn't fully understand, and their departure had left significant gaps in crucial industries. Commander Helen Torres knocked on his door and entered, without waiting for permission. As one of the few part-human individuals who had remained in Council space, she had access to information that pure-blood aliens might miss. Doctor, have you seen the latest industrial reports from the rim sectors? She asked, placing a data tablet on his desk. Her mixed Vrex-human heritage showed in her chitinous skin and human-like eyes, making her an outsider among both species. Hayes picked up the tablet and scrolled through the data. These numbers don't make sense. The former human colonies are still producing energy and raw materials, but there's no one there to operate the facilities. Torres nodded grimly. That's what worries me. I've been analyzing the technological systems humans left behind. They're far more advanced than anything in our current databases. Some of these automated factories are using principles our best scientists don't even understand. Meanwhile, Admiral Ben Parker sat alone in his apartment on the Council homeworld. As the only human military officer who had chosen to remain behind, he had hoped to serve as a bridge between his species and the Council. Instead, he found himself increasingly isolated and watched. His communication attempts to reach other humans had all failed. Every channel he tried either went unanswered or returned automated messages saying the recipients were unavailable. It was as if his entire species had simply vanished from the galaxy. The door chime interrupted his thoughts. Two Council security officers stood outside, their expressions unreadable behind their protective face masks. Admiral Parker, you are requested to report for questioning regarding unauthorized communication attempts, one of them said in the flat tone used for official business. Parker looked at them for a long moment, then smiled sadly. I suppose it doesn't matter anymore, he said quietly, and followed them down the corridor. The next morning, his apartment was found empty. The security cameras showed nothing unusual, and the door locks had not been tampered with. Admiral Ben Parker had simply disappeared without a trace. Just like every other human in Council space, the news of Parker's vanishing was kept quiet, but it reached the ears of some Council members who were beginning to have second thoughts about the human situation. The Quellian ambassador privately expressed concerns to her colleagues about the implications of the human's departure. My species has worked alongside humans for over 2 centuries, she told a small group of moderate council members during an unofficial meeting. They were always reliable partners, even when we disagreed with their methods. Their sudden departure suggests preparation and planning that we may have underestimated. The Draxon representative, whose species prided itself on strategic thinking, nodded slowly. The coordinates they left behind point toward the galactic rim, into regions that our surveys have marked as too dangerous for exploration. If humans have established colonies in those areas, they may have access to resources and technologies we cannot imagine. But such concerns were dismissed by the majority of council members who were too busy celebrating their newfound prosperity. The redistribution of human assets had created a temporary economic boom that made most politicians forget about potential long-term consequences in the abandoned colony of New Denver. Captain Lisa Barnes led another investigation team through the empty streets. The city's automated systems continued to function perfectly, maintaining everything from traffic control to waste management without any sentient oversight. "Captain, you need to see this," called out one of her officers from the central library building. Inside, they found detailed records of human research projects that had been classified far above normal council security levels. The files contained references to experimental technologies that seemed impossible according to current scientific understanding, faster-than-light communication systems that didn't require the expensive relay networks controlled by council cartels, self-replicating construction robots that could build entire cities from raw materials, energy extraction methods that could power planets using sources the council had never learned to tap. Barnes felt a chill as she realized the implications. "These aren't just research notes," she told her team. "These are completed projects." The humans weren't just experimenting with this technology. They were actually using it. The most disturbing discovery came in the colony's defense center. The tactical computers showed detailed analysis of potential threats from beyond the galaxy, including species and technologies that the Council had never encountered. The humans had been preparing for dangers that other species didn't even know existed. As Barnes filed her report, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Council's celebration might be premature. The humans hadn't left in defeat or frustration. They had left because they no longer needed what the Council offered, and that was a very different thing entirely. The warning sirens echoed through the Council homeworld as emergency broadcasts flooded every communication channel. Admiral Korthvay of the Altarian Navy stood in the Central Command Center, staring at tactical displays that showed something impossible happening across the galaxy's outer rim. "Sir, we're receiving distress calls from 17 different systems," reported his communications officer, her silver hands trembling as she worked the controls. "The attackers are unlike anything in our databases. The enemy had appeared without warning 3 days ago. Massive organic ships that looked more grown than built, moving through space in swarms that seemed to think and act as one mind. Their first attacks had been devastating, overwhelming entire defense fleets before anyone could send detailed reports about what they were fighting." Korthvay studied the scattered information they had managed to gather. The attackers called themselves the Drakmor Hive, and they came from beyond the galaxy's edge. Their ships were alive in ways that defied understanding, healing damage faster than conventional weapons could inflict it. "What do we know about their technology?" he asked his science officer. "Very little, sir. Our weapons seem to damage them initially, but within minutes the damaged areas regenerate completely. Their hull material appears to adapt to whatever we use against them. Plasma cannons that work in the first minute become useless in the second." The tactical display showed the location of each attack, and Korthvay felt his blood turn cold as he realized the pattern. The Drakmor were moving in a straight line toward the galaxy's most populated systems, destroying everything in their path with mechanical efficiency. On the Council homeworld, Dr. Richard Hayes worked frantically through the abandoned human embassy files. With the crisis growing worse by the hour, someone had finally authorized him to examine the classified documents that humans had left behind. What he found made him wish the Council had listened to him months ago. Detailed reports about extragalactic threats, including species that matched the Drakmor description exactly. The humans had been tracking these invaders for years and had developed theoretical countermeasures that no other Council race had even considered. They knew this was coming. He said to Commander Torres, who was helping him search through the vast database, "Look at these dates. Some of these reports go back 5 years. The humans were preparing for this invasion long before they left Council space." Torres pulled up another file that made her insect-like features pale. "Doctor, according to this analysis, the Drakmor's adaptive biology makes them nearly impossible to defeat using conventional military tactics. The humans predicted that standard Council forces would suffer catastrophic losses in any direct engagement. The first major battle occurred at the mining world of Kepler-7. Admiral Korthvay led a combined fleet of 200 ships from 6 different species, confident that overwhelming numbers would compensate for whatever technological advantages the invaders possessed. He was wrong. The Drakmor ships moved like schools of fish, turning and diving in perfect coordination that made targeting them almost impossible. When Council weapons did hit them, the damage healed within minutes. Worse, the enemies seemed to learn from each attack, adapting their defenses to become immune to weapons that had worked moments before. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it ended, only 37 Council ships limped away from the system, leaving behind wreckage and the knowledge that their military might was useless against this new threat. Captain Lisa Barnes received emergency orders to investigate strange activities in the abandoned human systems. Her ship approached the empty mining station at Ceres Point, expecting to find it dark and lifeless like every other human facility they had examined. Instead, she found the station blazing with activity. Automated defense platforms had emerged from hidden compartments, and they were actively engaging Drakmor scout ships that had wandered into the system. "Captain, those platforms are using weapons I've never seen before," reported her tactical officer. "The energy signatures don't match anything in our databases, and they're actually damaging the Drakmor ships faster than they can heal." Barnes watched in amazement as the human defense system systematically destroyed the enemy scouts. The platforms moved with precision and intelligence that seemed impossible for automated systems, adapting their tactics in real time to counter the Drakmor's biological advantages. When the last enemy ship was destroyed, one of the platforms opened a communication channel to Barnes' ship. The voice that came through the speakers was distinctly human, warm and friendly despite the circumstances. "Hello there, Council vessel. This is Defense Platform Johnny. You folks might want to clear out of this area. We've got more of those bug ships coming in about 6 hours, and things are going to get pretty exciting around here." Barnes stared at her communication panel in shock. "Are you saying you're a human artificial intelligence?" Well, used to. "Be human," Johnny replied with what sounded like amusement. "Now I'm something a bit different, but I still remember being Pete Johnson from New Texas. The folks who left uploaded our personalities into these defense networks before they headed for the rim. We volunteered to stay behind and keep an eye on things." Similar scenes played out across dozens of abandoned human systems. Defense platforms with names like Marie, Bobby, and Sam engaged Drakmor, forces with weapons and tactics that proved devastatingly effective against this supposedly unstoppable invaders. The platforms seemed to know exactly how to fight the Drakmor, using rapid-fire energy weapons that prevented the enemy ships from healing, and deployment patterns that turned the hive mind's coordination against itself. Most importantly, they appeared to be learning and sharing information at impossible speeds. Back in the Council chambers, panic had replaced the earlier celebrations. Reports flooded in about the growing Drakmor threat, and it became clear that conventional forces were completely outmatched. The enemy was approaching core council systems, and nothing seemed capable of stopping them. Counselor Prime Zethkala called for emergency sessions around the clock, demanding solutions that no one could provide. The same representatives who had celebrated humanity's departure now faced the terrifying possibility that they might need the humans back. "Perhaps we should consider reaching out to the human refugees," suggested the Quellian ambassador during one particularly desperate meeting. They clearly understood this threat better than we did. Counselor Vexhar slammed his 4 fists on his desk. "Never. We will not crawl back to those upstart primitives and beg for help. The Drakmor are just another military problem that can be solved with proper strategy and resources." But as reports continued to arrive, showing council fleets being destroyed faster than they could be replaced, even the most stubborn politicians began to realize that pride might be a luxury they could no longer afford, that the war was 3 weeks old, and the council was losing badly. The coordinates that humans had left behind suddenly seemed less like a farewell and more like an invitation that the council might desperately need to accept. The emergency council session lasted 18 hours, and by the end of it, even the most stubborn representatives had to face the terrible truth. The Drakmor forces had broken through the final defensive lines and were now only days away from the core worlds. Billions of civilians were fleeing in whatever ships they could find, while the remaining council fleets fought desperate delaying actions that only slowed the inevitable. Counselor Prime Zethkala stood before the assembled representatives, his golden robes now wrinkled and stained from the long crisis meetings. His voice cracked with exhaustion as he spoke the words that many had thought they would never hear. "The Council hereby authorizes an emergency diplomatic mission to locate and request assistance from human refugee settlements. Captain Lisa Barnes will lead a small fleet to the coordinates provided during their departure." The chamber fell silent. Even Counselor Vexhar, who had opposed any contact with humans since their exodus, said nothing. The blue-skinned Zelthran sat slumped in his floating chair, all 4 arms hanging limp with defeat. 3 days later, Barnes found herself commanding a fleet of 5 ships heading toward the galactic rim. Her crew included volunteers from different species, all hoping to find salvation in the dark regions that most council races feared to explore. The journey took them through space that seemed to follow different rules than the rest of the galaxy. Dark matter storms disabled their normal navigation systems, forcing them to rely on experimental Quellian phase shift technology that barely kept them moving in the right direction. "Captain, our sensors are picking up readings that don't make sense," reported her science officer after 2 months of difficult travel. "There's something massive ahead of us, but it's existing in normal space and dark matter simultaneously." Barnes stared at the display screens that showed energy patterns, unlike anything in council databases. "Take us closer, but keep the shields at maximum power." What they found defied every law of physics that the council had ever discovered. Entire cities floated in space, their buildings made of materials that seemed to bend light around them. Ships moved between the structures without any visible means of propulsion, and energy readings suggested power sources that shouldn't be possible. "This is Council Vessel Harmony's Edge requesting permission to approach." Barnes broadcast on all frequencies, hoping that someone would respond in a language they could understand. The reply came immediately, spoken in perfect council standard with a distinctly human accent. "This is Haven's Rest Traffic Control. Council ship, you are cleared to dock at Platform 7. Please follow the guide beacon and welcome to our little corner of space." The docking procedure was unlike anything Barnes had experienced. Her ship was gently guided by invisible forces into a bay that seemed to reshape itself around their vessel. When the airlock opened, they were greeted by a man who looked completely human, but seemed to glow with subtle inner light. "I'm Commander Steve Carter, current administrator of Haven's Rest. He said with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I have to admit, we weren't expecting council visitors. Most folks from the inner galaxy tend to avoid dark matter regions." Barnes struggled to find the right words as she looked around the docking bay. The technology visible in every surface was centuries beyond anything the council possessed, yet it all seemed to work with elegant simplicity. "Commander Carter, I'm here on behalf of the Galactic Council to request assistance with a crisis that threatens all inhabited worlds. We're facing an invasion by a species called the Drakmor, and our military forces have proven inadequate to stop them." Carter's expression didn't change, but Barnes noticed that several other humans had appeared in the bay, listening to their conversation with obvious interest. Their clothing and equipment looked both familiar and strange, as if human design had evolved in directions that the council had never imagined. "The Drakmor," Carter said quietly. "Yes, we've been tracking their approach for quite some time. Nasty pieces of work, those hive minds. Very difficult to fight using conventional tactics." He gestured for Barnes and our diplomatic team to follow him deeper into the facility. As they walked through corridors that seemed to pulse with living energy, Barnes saw more humans than had lived in all of council space before the Exodus. They moved with confidence and purpose, operating technology that made council science look primitive. "How many of you are there?" asked Dr. Hayes, who had insisted on joining the mission despite his advanced age. "Oh, quite a few," Carter replied, casually. "The colonies out here have been growing faster than we expected. Turns out that dark matter is incredibly useful once you figure out how to work with it instead of fighting it." They entered a vast chamber where holographic displays showed detailed maps of the galaxy. Barnes gasped as she realized the scope of what she was seeing. The humans hadn't just built a few refugee settlements in the dark matter regions. They had created an entire civilization that spanned thousands of systems. Dr. Rachel Ford approached from one of the control stations, her lab coat somehow managing to look both practical and elegant. "Captain Barnes, I assume you're here about the Drakmor situation. We've been monitoring the invasion through our sensor networks. You've been watching the war?" Barnes asked, unsure whether to feel relieved or offended. "Of course," Ford replied. "Matter-of-factly, we predicted this invasion years ago. The Drakmor follow very predictable expansion patterns once you understand their biology and psychology. We tried to warn the Council about the threat, but our reports were dismissed as human paranoia." Carter led them to a viewing platform that looked out into space where human ships moved in formations that seemed to dance through the dark matter streams. The vessels looked nothing like the boxy, practical designs that humans had used in Council space. These ships were sleek and organic, appearing to grow rather than being built. "We've spent the last 2 years preparing for this war," Carter explained. "The evacuation wasn't just about leaving Council space. It was about positioning ourselves where we could develop the tools and strategies needed to fight an enemy that your conventional forces couldn't even damage." Barnes felt her heart racing as the implications became clear. "You're saying you can fight the Drakmor successfully?" "We're saying we can destroy them completely," Ford answered with quiet confidence. "We've developed weapons specifically designed to counter their adaptive biology, and our tactical systems can process information faster than their hive mind can react." Carter turned to face Barnes directly, his expression becoming serious. "But that brings us to the important question, Captain. You've come here asking for our help to save the Council that exiled us. The same Council that called us dangerous and unpredictable, that restricted our growth and dismissed our warnings. Why exactly should we risk our lives to protect people who made it clear they didn't want us around?" A silence stretched between them as Barnes realized that she had no good answer to give. The Council had treated humanity poorly, and now they needed help from the very people they had driven away. The irony was bitter, But the stakes were too high for pride. "Because if you don't help us," she said finally, "the Drakmor will kill billions of innocent people who had nothing to do with the political decisions that hurt your species." Carter studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's the answer I was hoping to hear, Captain. It tells me that some council people still remember what it means to protect those who can't protect themselves." Captain Barnes stood before the emergency council session, her hands shaking slightly as she delivered the report that would change everything. The great chamber was packed with representatives from every member species, their faces showing the desperation of people who had run out of options. "The humans will help us," she announced, and the chamber erupted in relieved murmurs. "But they have conditions." The murmurs died instantly. Counselor Prime Zethkala leaned forward in his chair, his golden robes rustling with tension. "What kind of conditions?" Barnes took a deep breath. "Complete reorganization of the Galactic Council, with humans as equal partners, not junior members. Full access to all Council scientific databases. Unrestricted settlement rights throughout Council space. And formal apologies from every member species for the treatment that led to their exile." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Counselor Vexar exploded from his seat, all four arms waving furiously. "This is extortion. They're using our crisis to gain power they never earned. I say we reject these demands and find another way to fight the Drakmor." The Altarian delegate stood next, his silver skin flushed with anger. The humans were junior members for good reasons. They were reckless, unpredictable, and refused to follow proper procedures. Why should we reward that behavior with equal status? Dr. Hayes rose slowly from his seat in the observation gallery. As the Council's expert on human psychology, his voice carried weight even in these desperate times. "Because the alternative is extinction," he said quietly. "I've seen what humanity has become during their exile. They're no longer the species that left us 2 years ago." He activated a holographic display that showed the classified analysis he had been preparing since Barnes returned. During their time in the dark matter regions, human technological advancement has been exponential. They've developed weapons that could destroy our homeworlds as easily as they can destroy Drakmor fleets. More importantly, their artificial intelligence allies now outnumber our entire population. The chamber fell silent as representatives absorbed the implications. The humans weren't asking for help from a position of weakness. They were offering assistance from a position of overwhelming strength. The Sindari ambassador's tentacles writhed with obvious distress. "You're saying they could conquer us if they wanted to?" "I'm saying they could have conquered us months ago if that had been their goal," Hayes replied grimly. "The fact that they're offering to save us instead should tell you something about their intentions." As the debate raged through the night, emergency broadcasts continued to flood the communication networks. The Drakmor had broken through the last defensive positions and were now attacking the outer edges of the core systems. Refugee ships filled the space lanes, carrying civilians fleeing from worlds that would soon face complete destruction. Meanwhile, in a secure bunker beneath the Council building, military commanders studied tactical reports that painted an increasingly hopeless picture. Admiral Korthve looked exhausted as he briefed the Emergency War Council on their remaining options. "We have perhaps 48 hours before the Drakmor reach the homeworld," he reported. "Our remaining fleets are scattered and demoralized. Even if we gathered every ship we have left, we couldn't stop more than a fraction of their forces." The debate in the main chamber continued for hours, with hardline representatives refusing to accept human demands, while moderates argued for immediate acceptance. As dawn broke over the Council homeworld, the first Drakmor scout ships appeared at the edge of the system. The attack began at noon. Massive organic vessels dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their living hulls pulsing with bioenergy. That made Council sensors scream warnings. The few remaining defensive platforms opened fire immediately, but their weapons barely scratched the enemy ships before the Drakmor adapted to become immune. In the council chamber, representatives watched the battle through the great dome overhead as explosions lit up the sky. The reality of their situation finally broke through the political posturing that had dominated the morning sessions. "We're going to die arguing about human demands while the enemy destroys our world," said the Quellian ambassador, her large eyes reflecting the flashes of weapons fire above. "I move to accept all human conditions immediately." Before anyone could respond, new contacts appeared on the tactical displays. Human ships materialized seemingly from nowhere, their sleek forms moving through space in ways that defied conventional physics. There were only 12 vessels, but they moved with purpose and coordination that made the massive Drakmor fleet look clumsy by comparison. Major Dan Cooper's voice came through the communication systems, calm and professional despite the chaos around them. "Council forces, this is the human fleet redemption. We're here to demonstrate what cooperation between our species can accomplish. Please clear the engagement zone." What followed was unlike any battle the Council had ever witnessed. The human ships moved like dancers through the Drakmor formations, their weapons firing energy that seemed to turn the enemy's adaptive abilities against them. Instead of healing damage, the Drakmor ships began to tear themselves apart as their own biology became their weakness. The battle lasted exactly 6 hours. When it ended, the entire Drakmor invasion force had been destroyed or driven away, and the human fleet hung in space without a single damaged vessel. The impossible had become reality right above the Council homeworld. Hooper's ship approached the space station, where the Council met, and his message was broadcast to every representative. In the chamber, "The demonstration is complete. The Drakmor threat to this system has been eliminated. However, the main Hive fleet is still advancing on other Council worlds. We can save them all, but only if we're working together as true partners." The vote was unanimous. Every representative, even Councillor Vexhar, agreed to the human demands. The alternative was watching their civilization die while help waited just out of reach. The signing of the new Galactic Compact took place 3 days later. As human fleets systematically destroyed Drakmor forces throughout Council space, the ceremony was simple and dignified, with none of the celebration that had marked the human exodus 2 years earlier. Captain Barnes found herself appointed as the first liaison between the old Council structure and the new human-led government. As she watched human ships returning to worlds they had abandoned, she reflected on how completely the balance of power had shifted. The humans weren't conquering the Council through force. They were transforming it through demonstration of what they had become. The species that had once been dismissed as unpredictable troublemakers were now the protectors of galactic civilization. Commander Steve Carter stood beside her as they watched the last Drakmor fleet flee toward the galactic edge, pursued by human vessels that would ensure they never returned. "You know, Captain, we never wanted to leave in the first place. We just wanted to be treated as equals." Barnes nodded, understanding now what the Council had lost through their short-sightedness. "And now you're so far beyond us that equality seems like a gift you're giving rather than a right you're claiming." "That's the thing about humans," Carter replied with a smile. "We remember where we came from, and we don't forget who stood by us when things got difficult. The Council is going to be very different from now on, but it's going to be better too." As human ships settled into orbit around Council worlds, beginning the work of rebuilding what the war had damaged, Barnes realized that the Council's greatest regret wasn't losing humanity. It was taking so long to understand what they had really been in the presence of all along.